first of two interviews looking at legislation to change the way Congress is notified of covert actions by the administration.
Sven Holmes, Staff Director and General Counsel of the Senate Intelligence Committee. What's the motivation behind S-1721, otherwise known as the Covert Action Bill, currently before the Senate?
Well, Bruce, certainly a number of the issues in 1721 were put in very clear focus by the Iran-Contra affair, although it would be too simplistic to say that that was the primary motivation, because the Intelligence Committee, in fact, has been working on ways to strengthen the oversight process literally going back for the last 7 or 8 years. So the work had begun earlier, but in point of fact, the Iran-Contra really gave a lot of impetus to that process and brought it to a closure.
Let me ask your colleague in opposite number, Britt Snider, Minority Counsel of the Senate Intelligence Committee. What are the key elements of this bill?
Well, the bill primarily focuses on covert actions and the standards by which the President approves covert actions, what conditions that govern his decision and reporting that decision to the Congress. That's the focus of it.
And before we get done with this discussion, I'll ask you your conclusion as to what do you think is going to happen to it. But let's talk about the particulars of it. There's something called the 48-hour requirement. What is that?
48-hour requirement is basically a congressional statement that if the President is to undertake covert operations through the execution of what is called a finding, that within 48 hours of signing that finding, he must notify Congress that in fact such a finding has been signed and that a covert operation is about to be undertaken.
Britt Snider, why is it that the legislation would require the President personally to act or to report and not the Director of the CIA, for example?
Well, the President has to sign the finding. He doesn't have to report that personally to the committee. That can be done, in fact, by the Director of Central Intelligence. But the purpose of the bill's provision that the President himself take responsibility for it was to ensure that no matter what department, agency of the executive branch may be given this sort of assignment or task, that it would in fact be the President's responsibility to ensure that it's reported to the Congress.
Did you want to say something about the 48-hour requirement?
Yes, I just wanted to elaborate on what Sven said. I think it's important for people to understand that the normal rule in this area is prior notice to the two intelligence committees. And in fact, there has been no case other than the Iran-Contra situation where the committees were not notified in advance of a finding being implemented. And so what we're talking about here with the 48-hour rule is an exceptional circumstance.
We ought to talk about what the current law is.
Well, the current law provides that, as Britt says, that in all but exceptional circumstances there should be prior notification.
Is that the 1980 law?
That's the 1980 law. There is an exception which provides that in cases of rarest circumstances, the President so determines that he may notify Congress, quote, in a timely manner. And it was in fact that question of what did a timely manner constitute that gave rise to a very clear need to be more specific and to bring that down to a time certain. And that's why what the committee looked at is what is an appropriate time certain that will serve as the safety net in cases where prior notification is not utilized, but rather it is going to be after the fact, after the signing of the finding. How much time should be given? Where does the President's proper constitutional authority to initiate an action start coming up against Congress's proper constitutional need to have information, to fulfill its responsibility under the Constitution to appropriate monies for executive branch undertakings? And I think that's what this bill is, a very careful approach to trying to delineate those between those two responsibilities and to work out the two activities simultaneously without kind of this this amorphous, timely manner. And in fact, there were some who argued, and the executive branch, a member of the Justice Department, argued as a matter of their view of the law that timely fashion, by its very nature, meant that the President could decide whenever he felt it was appropriate to notify Congress. And clearly in the balance of powers, there's no balance in that. That's simply an open-ended authority to the executive branch.
Britt Snider, what's your response to the argument that the administration has made that this is an unconstitutional infringement on his executive powers?
Well, I think our response is that this is an area, covert actions, of shared constitutional power. As Sven pointed out, the Congress appropriates money for these activities. These activities have the potential for drawing the U.S. into combat situations. They have a potential for affecting the military readiness of the armed forces. And certainly they raise other policy problems that Congress, carrying out its legislative responsibilities, has a need to know and an ability to deal with. And they can't deal with them unless they know about them. And so, the President obviously has some constitutional responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief to undertake actions to protect U.S. interests overseas. But these are not powers and prerogatives that, avoid the Congress, or that necessarily mean that Congress can't play in this, excuse me, the decisions.
Let's talk about the definition of covert action, and I would suppose that the definition really goes to the heart of it because it would trigger or not trigger the requirement. How does the bill handle the definition problem?
Well, the way the legislation ultimately was crafted was to seek to maintain the current definitions of covert actions, or set out in the bill, special activities. Currently, special activities are governed by two independent sources of authority. One is the Hughes-Ryan statutory source of authority, and the second is Executive Order 12333. Now, what this bill attempts to do is rather than make some kind of major overhaul in those definitions, is to set them out comprehensively in a statutory form and to put in place, as a matter of statute rather than executive order, a comprehensive definition which in effect is the current definitions of special activity. It's not meant to change it. To change it would be, it's something that we are looking at and with the executive branch, but did not feel that in this particular legislation it was appropriate to do that.
One of the arguments, too, that we've heard against it is the problem of leaks. The more people who know, the more leaks. Your staff people of the Intelligence Committee, how do you respond to that issue?
Well, I can say this, as far as the Senate Intelligence Committee is concerned, that we have had no leaks of information involving a covert action program in the history of the committee. This information is protected very stringently. It is kept in vaulted areas during the day. Neither senators nor the staff can remove it from those bases. We have, in fact, in the compartmented, or in the covert action area, we have compartments so that unless you're in a particular compartment and a member of the staff, you don't get access. So that instead of 30 or 35 people having access, it really turns out to be more like 7 or 8 on the committee staff.
I take it you both have security clearances.
We certainly do.
What level?
Well, we have the highest level clearances in the, in the government. We have access to all of the intelligence programs of the government.
As far as the Congress is concerned, security and leaks is not a problem in this bill?
No, it's not a problem in this bill. I think it is, that is not to say that the Congress isn't always concerned about security. I think that's something that the Intelligence Committees view as a fundamental responsibility to do our share to participate in the oversight process. And we have very tight security procedures, and feels that pursuant to those procedures that it really doesn't create the opportunity for leaks.
Well, Mr. Holmes, this is an area that is not generally or is widely known about how the Intelligence Committee of the Congress interacts with the executive on these sensitive matters. And as you know, in these programs on Sunday nights, our focus is process and policy, and this is a process that really could bear some explanation. How does a piece of sensitive information get transferred, and who looks at it, who doesn't, and do even some senators get denied access? I don't know. Why don't you just talk to it?
Well, I think this is a very important area, and I think it really helps to demonstrate not only why this is a good bill, but the philosophy underlying the bill. And that is that the intelligence committees in this special area of covert operations operates to some large degree as the surrogate for the American public. Policy in the United States is generally formulated in public. The elected representatives, the American people, have an opportunity to react, to say this is bad, we should shift it this way or that way. And that's one of the things that makes a democracy great and makes it strong. Well, in a covert operation, by its very nature, it cannot go through that process. It cannot be tested against public opinion. It cannot be tested against open criticism by the press and by the elected representatives. To the contrary, it is brought merely to the intelligence committees, 15 members on the Senate and House, and presented as an undertaking that the administration is going to do that will be denied that they ever participated in it. And the committees effectively take this in and serve just 15 as the entire public testing ground, because even their reactions are private. They can't go to the public. They can't go to other members even of the United States Senate. They are the entire cauldron of public opinion embodied in 15 people. And the way the process works is if the President signs a finding, that the finding is brought and presented to the members of the Intelligence Committee. They're briefed on the contents of the finding, what the objectives are, and why it's been undertaken, and other kinds of oversight concerns that the committee would raise.
Britt, Snider, how many of the staff people have the level of security clearance that a senator would have?
Well, first of all, you ought to understand senators aren't cleared. Senators, by their position, have access to any level of classified information that they need to carry out their responsibilities.
Of the committee, or all 100 senators?
No, just on the committee.
Okay.
At this point.
So they don't have the background checks, just by the membership on the committee.
That's correct.
I see. But you, on the other hand, as a staffer, had to go through a
extensive background checks.
Mm-hmm.
We also, as staff, have to sign agreements with the committee, which where we recognize our responsibilities to protect the information that we're going to have access to. We recognize that if we don't protect it, we'll be fired. We have to sign agreements that whereby we agree that we will submit documents we want to publish in the area of intelligence for review before they're published, and it's quite a stringent regime there that the staff has to undergo.
And how many people are we talking about for those requirements?
We're talking about, what, Sven, 35, 36, something like that.
Yeah. And that would be on the Senate side only?
That's correct.
What about the House side, do you know?
The House side has a smaller staff, I think around 25, is my recollection.
Mm-hmm.
They have a similar regime over there. And it's, I might add, the senators themselves are told when they join the committee that if they are found to be responsible for leaks, that they will be removed from the committee by the leadership. So that's a fairly powerful, deterrent, I would think.
And the legislation contemplates several levels of notice, or at least I've seen different proposals. Some would notify all 15, some would notify only the Speaker and the Majority Leader. Can you walk through that, and what do you think is going to be the final outcome?
Well, there's effectively 3 levels of notice, and the first level of notice, which is the level which is contemplated in nearly all cases, And in fact, in the history of the notification of these programs, only in a couple of limited instances has it not been followed. And that's notification of the intelligence committees in their entirety. Now, under the rarest of circumstances described, as described in the bill, the President may determine to narrow that notification down to the chairman and vice chairman of the two intelligence committees, as well as the Speaker and majority leader and minority leaders of the House and Senate. It's the so-called Gang of Eight. And the third level, which is really the President makes a determination that there is very serious security concerns, very rare circumstances, that he can narrow it further still to the Gang of Four, which is the Speaker and minority leader of the House and majority minority leader of the Senate. And in that situation, what you're really talking about is not so much an activity that would be an intelligence, something that would require particular expertise in the area of intelligence, but rather an undertaking such as taking the hostages in Iran that came out through the Canadian embassy and has been discussed since that time, that it doesn't require any expertise to know that there were Iranian hostages, and what you're saying is we're in luck. Fortunately, there's some who managed to get out of the embassy, they're in the Canadian embassy, and we're about to embark on a program to bring them out. And that would be the kind of thing that potentially could be narrowed even to the Gang of Four.
It's interesting here that Senator Cohen, who was the principal sponsor of this bill and vice chairman of the committee, actually disagreed with the Gang of Four, so to speak. He preferred having the 8 leaders notified, which would include the Intelligence Committee chairman and vice chairman, primarily because he was interested in saying that those who had the knowledge in the area, who knew the right questions to ask about covert actions they were being advised of, would in fact be informed. He went along with the Gang of Four in order to have a compromise within the committee and vote the bill out, but he would have preferred the Gang of 8.
Well, I ought to point out that Senator Cohen, as the chief sponsor, is the vice chairman of the committee, as you just did, but you report to him. He's your boss.
That's correct.
And Sven Holmes, your boss, is the committee chairman, David Boren.
That's right.
Democrat of Oklahoma, and he's floor managing the bill.
He and Senator Cohen both are floor managing the bill together.
Why don't we just back up just a second and talk about the bipartisan nature of the committee and how it operates, and if you have a comment or two about, there was a time when all of our foreign policy was bipartisan. Do you think that's still the case, and so forth?
Well, in terms of foreign policy, I'm not, I don't think I'm really competent or to comment, but as far as intelligence is concerned, I can say it's a very bipartisan approach.
Is there partisanship in this debate?
Very little. The bill was reported from our committee by a vote of 13-2, which indicates in itself the bipartisan support it had within the committee. And I think this is an issue that, just simply should not be treated along partisan lines. It's not that sort of an issue. It's what Congress needs to know in order to do its job. That's what we're talking about here.
Sven Holmes, any?
Well, I think that Britt is exactly right. Within our committee, the view is simply that the intelligence is much too important an area to have partisan views, and certainly from the top, and the relationship between Senator Boren and Senator Cohen is one of tremendous respect and cooperation, and right on down the line, within the committee, it's a full participation by both sides of the aisle, and to be truthful with you, when we start talking about putting together particular task forces or groups to study different problems, honestly never occurs to us. I do it with Britt and with the minority staff director, and we talk about people who have some expertise in the area and time, and it never even is raised that they were representative of one party or another.
In fact, it's, I think, noteworthy that we do not have a ranking minority member of the committee. We have a vice chairman. When the chairman is not there, the vice chairman assumes the chair of the committee. It's not passed to a Democrat.
Like all the other committees.
Like all the other committees on the Hill.
Mm-hmm.
So that just that in itself is an indication of the bipartisan nature of the committee.
Before we talk about what's going to happen in the Senate next week, can you give us a status report, Britt, Snider, about where this thing is on the House side, if anywhere?
Yes. On the House side, there has been a bill introduced by the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Stokes, that is very similar to the bill that's now pending before the Senate. That bill is currently the subject of hearings by the House Intelligence Committee. But so far, as far as I know, they have not scheduled any committee action on that bill.
Is there, give us a general opinion as to whether or not both houses are tracking along so that there might be legislation before the year is out?
Yes, they are tracking along together, and one of the reasons is that there is a good deal of cooperation and communication between ourselves and the House Counsel and House side staff director as well. And in fact, we worked together with them in the early stages of talking about ways in which to strengthen this process. And Congressman Stokes testified in favor of 1721 as part of our hearing. So there's been a very close cooperation. We anticipate that it'll work right on through to the point of having legislation this year.
All right, where does this bill, S-1721, stand right now?
S-1721 is on the floor calendar. It was called up for action on Thursday afternoon, last Thursday afternoon, and opening statements were made on Thursday, and on Friday the bill was on the floor all day. There was one amendment that was brought to a vote, which was probably the most significant amendment that, had it been successful, would have really changed the shape of the legislation. And that amendment was defeated 65 to 23.
What was that amendment?
That amendment was to basically strip out the 48-hour provision and to open up again this opportunity for the chief executive to take as long as he deemed it necessary to notify the Congress. And in so doing would essentially undermine the ability of Congress to fulfill its responsibility.
Britt Snider, when it's on the floor, does that mean that the non-germane amendment problem has been solved? Is the Panama question, for example, no longer a concern as we look forward to a debate and a vote?
No, in fact, the Panama amendment, as I recall, would be the pending item of business.
What is that?
This was an amendment that was offered up by Senator Helms on Friday afternoon, and the thrust of it was that it was a sense of the Senate resolution that that said basically that if efforts were not made to extradite General Noriega to the United States to face the drug charges that have been brought against him, that the United States would then consider such actions as removing American dependents from Panama, that sort of thing.
So there will be debate and a vote on that?
Well, assuming that Senator Helms wants to pursue that, yes. I mean, he obviously has the option of withdrawing his amendment at any time he chooses.
Did I understand correctly that Senator Byrd has filed a cloture motion?
Senator Byrd has filed a cloture motion, and the purpose of that was to try to at least get a handle on the possibility of a series of non-germane amendments. Certainly the issues that were raised on Friday, both with respect to the Panama Canal and also with respect to SS-20s, while very important issues and concerns, are simply not germane to this bill. And of course, as you well know, Bruce, if you can bring the thing through on a cloture motion, then you have the opportunity to strip out some of the non-germane issues and get really down to the substance of the bill.
I know staff people don't always want to get too much in the fray, but are you willing to offer an opinion as to whether this bill could survive a veto?
Well, I think it could survive a veto, sure.
Do you think it'll have to, Sven Holmes?
I think that, I think first of all that it can survive a veto, as evidenced by the fact that the amendment on Friday was a 65 to 23 vote. So of the remaining 12 members, all you need is one 2 additional members, and you were able to survive a veto. Second of all, I think that as the President, the Chief Executive, takes a very close look, and he recognizes ultimately the strong bipartisan support, comes to appreciate the responsibility with which this legislation was approached, that some of the harder line positions, as articulated by the legal representative from the Justice Department, will really be put in context, and I think there's a good chance that he will sign the bill.
Last word, Britt Snider, when is it going to pass the Senate?
Hopefully this week.
Sven, same?
I think so.
All right, thank you both. Sven Holmes, Staff Director and General Counsel for the Senate Intelligence Committee, and Britt Snider, Minority Counsel for the same committee. Appreciate you being with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next on C-SPAN, we continue our look at legislation governing the way Congress is notified of covert action as we bring you an interview with Daniel Silver, who's the former General Counsel for the CIA.
Daniel Silver, former General Counsel of the CIA. Do you believe that the proposal currently before the Senate to require presidential notice to Congress of covert projects is a good idea?
No, I don't. I think it's an ill-considered reaction to a very strong provocation, but nonetheless misguided.
What was that provocation?
Well, I think the provocation obviously was the or so-called Iran-Contra affair, and the failure of the administration to notify the Congress of a covert activity which appeared to be a subject for notification under the existing Intelligence Oversight Act of 1980.
Now, you were General Counsel from 1979 to 81. You were involved in the creation of the existing rule?
Yes, I was.
What is the existing rule?
Well, the existing rule on notification required so-called timely notification, a term which was vague. It was deliberately vague. The legislation at that time was an attempt to strike a rather tenuous balance between the constitutional prerogatives and aspirations of the executive branch and the legislative branch, neither of which, unfortunately, is clear. We're dealing here in essentially a gray area under the Constitution. The drafting of that legislation in that respect and in a number of other respects deliberately erred on the side of ambiguity because there was no way to reconcile the assertions of the Congress to an absolute right to be informed of everything, and the assertion of the President that he had constitutional obligations which were incumbent on him whether or not the Congress was informed of covert activities.
Now, we've already talked with the staff about what's in this bill. What is your fundamental objection to it? By the way, the bill being S-1721.
Well, I have a number of objections. Basically, I think what this legislation does is to throw down a gauntlet before the executive branch, before the President, on the issue of his constitutional authorities. And it does this not only, by the way, with respect to so-called prior notice of covert actions, which are called special activities in this bill, and that being the point which has gotten, I think, virtually all of the attention in the press, such as there has been, but it also does it in the area of intelligence collection, in which the bill removes some very important preambular language that is in the existing legislation, recognizing the existence of certain constitutional prerogatives. Let me correct that, because certainly the people on the congressional side would take exception with what I just said, not recognizing but reserving such powers as may exist, not purporting to infringe on the constitutional powers of the President to conduct intelligence activities outside the scope of the bill. That has been substantially eroded in the new proposed legislation with respect to intelligence collection, and with respect to special activities. The bill flatly requires prior notice before the initiation of those activities. The only reference to the constitutional prerogatives of the President that one finds in the bill is a statement that it is not intended to detract from his constitutional power to initiate intelligence activities without notifying the Congress. And I believe that those words were chosen very carefully so as to exclude any presidential power to conduct intelligence activities once initiated. In other words, the Congress is leaving only, if this bill is passed, a very small crack in the door for the President to initiate an activity as long as he immediately thereafter gives notice to the Congress. What this does, in my view, is, as I said before, is to really throw down a gauntlet, make any president who, for whatever compelling reason, which may be a good reason as well as a misguided reason, as in the Iran situation, feels that he needs to initiate and conduct an intelligence activity, whether it be collection or special activities, without notifying the Congress, he really does it at his peril.
In the wake of the Iran-Contra affair, do you believe any legislation is necessary?
I really don't.
You like the current law?
I can't say that I like the current law. I think it has its own constitutional defects or raises constitutional issues, but I think it was the best that could be done in a very difficult set of circumstances where there's very little guidance as to how to work out the arrangements between the two branches of government. My view as to what needs to be done in the wake of the Iran-Contra affair is a job of rebuilding, or perhaps simply building, a climate of confidence between the executive branch and the oversight organs of the Congress, so that confrontations don't arise in the future, so that as a matter of wise decision on the part of the President, the leaders of Congress are kept informed of potentially controversial or significant intelligence activities in both the collection and covert action areas.
Does it take legislation to do that?
I think, on the contrary, the legislation, by creating a climate of confrontation, will exacerbate the tensions that are inherent in the relations between the executive and the Congress, and will make it harder. It also is diverting the attention of both the executive branch and, I would submit, of the Congress from the real issues of how do you create a climate of trust, what can the Congress do to make itself a more palatable recipient of sensitive information, to be less confrontational in its relationship with the executive branch in the intelligence area, and on the other side, how can the executive branch become more responsible and responsive in dealing with the Congress. Those are issues that are just being lost sight of, I believe.
Back to the bill, how bothered are you, if at all, that the bill requires the President to notify the Congress instead of the Director of the CIA?
I think it is undesirable to impose obligations of that kind on the President.
Why?
Because I think more symbolically than perhaps in any other way, it exacerbates again the confrontational or tension-creating aspects of the legislation, and tends to some degree to demean the presidency. I don't think there's a constitutional difference. The Director of Central Intelligence is acting as the president's surrogate, in effect, under the present legislation in informing the Congress about intelligence activities.
Who's against this bill? I mean, you are a former general counsel of the agency and currently in private practice here in Washington. You're not speaking alone on this, I would take it.
Well, I don't feel that I'm in a very large crowd, in part because this legislation has received very little attention, and I think that that's quite deplorable, if not downright shocking. It's a very important piece of legislation, albeit in an area that's largely outside the public view, and I think what's happening is that those in the Congress who are seeking to symbolically aggrandize their claims to, in effect, be co-managers of the intelligence operations of the United States are exploiting an opportunity created by indignation resulting from the Iran-Contra affair to push forward a piece of legislation which is not being, I believe, as carefully considered as it should be, which is certainly not being reported on in the press. And my guess would be that most people have no idea of anything about this legislation, or if they do, they think that it's a minor adjustment to the procedures for notifying the Congress of special activities. My belief is that at least on the 48-hour prior notice point that the administration is opposing the bill, Are there any non-congressional or non-administrative types out there other than yourself that you know of? Well, against the bill? There are some other individuals, former government officials involved with, for example, the American Bar Association's Standing Committee on Law and National Security. A group of us wrote a report to that committee, which was entirely personal, but certainly represented considerable reservations about the bill on the part of a number of former government officials. There are some organizations such as the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, which I believe have submitted criticisms of the legislation to the committees.
As a practical matter, why oppose the bill at all? Do you believe that this notice requirement is somehow going to interfere with legitimate covert activities?
I think that in probably the vast majority of cases it will not interfere. On the other hand, I believe that there have been cases in the past in which notification before the commencement and indeed before the completion of the activity would have enhanced the risks to such a degree that that one would have hesitated to engage in them at all.
What is the risk?
Well, the risk is simply a risk of disclosure, and that is not intended to impugn the integrity or reliability of anyone in the Congress or on the staffs of these committees, but it's essentially an axiom of security practice that if you tell a secret to 100 people, it's substantially less safe than if you tell it to 2 people, even if individually every one of those 100 people is believed to be reliable. In this case, you're dealing with sizable committees, with sizable staffs, with a machinery in the executive branch in order to make these notifications, which again expands the group of those who are in the know, and there is a security problem. I think that because let me try and phrase this in steps. I mean, the first step is that the Congress cannot take away the President's inherent constitutional authority. And if the President has such an authority to carry on a covert action or intelligence collection activity without notifying the Congress, this bill will not change it, although it will certainly reduce it to, as the Supreme Court has said, to its lowest ebb. However, as a matter of politics, I think any president who would act in the future in contravention of this bill would risk having himself, when the facts became known, considered by the vast majority of the American people as a lawbreaker. And I think most people have difficulty conceiving of the fact that the president may have a duty constitutionally to not to abide by an unconstitutional law. In these circumstances, he has no way of testing it in the court, and therefore he has no choice but to proceed in defiance of the law. I think that would be a very hard position for the president to bring himself to in the future, and very hard to defend afterwards. So that this law is, in effect, either going to encourage inaction in this very small number of sensitive cases to which I refer, or it will incite confrontations, constitutional crises of the kind that we've just gone through, in a sense, with Iran and the Contras, and I don't think those are good for the country.
As you know, this discussion we're having now is part of C-SPAN's process and policy programming, which is, in this case, a continuing look at the covert operations law. And with that process and that policy in mind, what's your view about whether or not, or how would the Iran-Contra situation have played out had this law been in effect and had the president complied with it?
Well, in that particular case, I dare say that if the law had been in effect and the president had complied with it, it never would have happened.
Isn't that the point of those who argue on behalf of the new law?
I'm sure it is.
And your response to that?
My response to that is that I deplore as much as anyone else, I believe, what the president did in the Iran-Contra affair. I personally believe that a president who was doing his job properly would consult, whether there were a law in the books or not, with the Congress, just as a matter of self-preservation. I think it's very ill-advised for a president to launch a clandestine activity which anyone can see has enormous potential for blowing up in his face without at least trying to co-opt, if I can put it that way, some of the congressional leadership, so that he's not all alone when the flap begins. So there was, in that case, I think a bad policy, bad judgment, all sorts of bad things, but that doesn't mean that we should pass a bad law to respond to it.
Bad or not, getting back to the process part of it, technically what would the president have been required to do? He made an oral agreement to ship arms. Would the law have required him to write it down? Would it have required him to make a phone call, submit a letter? What would it have been?
Well, it would have required him, first of all, to write it down, either to sign a written finding or to sign such a finding. I believe the law provides within 48 hours after making it orally in exceptional circumstances. And again, let me stress, I think that that's a very desirable thing, a very desirable procedure, but I have serious doubts as to whether it is constitutionally permissible for the Congress to tell the president how he should make decisions. Then the president would have had to give prior notice either to the committees, or there's a kind of descending hierarchy or ascending hierarchy of restricted disclosure, and probably in this case he would have felt it was appropriate to use the most restrictive approach, which is to inform the leadership of the two houses and to show them a copy of the finding, but not to leave them a copy of the finding, and then every week thereafter to report to them on whether it was still going on and whether the circumstances had changed.
In the remaining minutes, let's speak to the issue of the definition of covert activities. The bill attempts to do that. In fact, it does. Do you think it's possible to define, in order to solve the covert activities, to the point where it's effective?
Well, the definition which is in the bill is essentially a definition that has been in the President's executive orders on intelligence for many years now, through several administrations. And given the nature of these activities, finding a perfect definition is almost impossible. I think this definition is about as good as one can get, and has the virtue of being generally understood in the intelligence community.
So you don't have a, that is not an issue as far as you're concerned.
Well, there's one issue in the definition, which is that the draftsman of the bill, in addition to adopting a perfectly, I think, reasonably good definition, let's say, of special activities, has chosen to continue to impose on the CIA the obligation to report every activity abroad which is not conducted for the sole purpose of intelligence collection, a formula that goes back to the Hughes-Ryan Amendment many years ago. I think there's no need or place for that in any amended legislation.
Last word, whether or not it's a good bill or a bad bill, are you willing to make a prediction as to whether it will become law?
Well, I think the odds at the moment are very strong in the Senate. I suspect they're probably strong in the House. The real question in my mind is if the President vetoes the bill, which I hope he would and expect that he would, whether the Congress has the votes and the will to override.
Dan Silver, former General Counsel of the CIA, thanks for helping us on process and policy as we wrap up our discussion of the Covert Action Bill. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Next on C-SPAN, we re-air our process and policy call-in, which this week looks at the B-1 bomber as an example of how the defense contracting process works. Our guest is Nick Cotts, author of the book Wild Blue Yonder, Money, Politics, and the B-1 Bomber.
Nick Cotts, author of the newly published book Wild Blue Yonder, subtitled Money, Politics, and the B-1 Bomber. Tell us first, if you will, why you wrote this book.
I wrote the book, Bob, because, first of all, I wanted to find out how we make defense decisions. And if I succeeded in finding out, I wanted to try to explain to citizens how we make those decisions. The book came out of concern that defense is a subject that is seemingly so complex, so difficult to understand, that we as citizens don't participate in the process very much. I tried to, in Wild Blue Yonder, I tried to, by following one story, to show how the defense decision-making process works, particularly the politics of it.
Before we get more deeply into the question of money and politics, can you bring us up to date on the B-1 bomber, which, as you note in your book, has been called both the best warplane in the world and the flying Edsel?
Well, the Air Force has been trying to get a new bomber for 30 years. They finally got it. In the last month, the last of 100 bombers have been delivered to the Air Force at a cost of about $28 billion, or $280 million a plane. The B-1 is a strategic bomber. Its mission is to be a deterrent against war if war came, to be able to fly to the deepest heart of the Soviet Union. We have 100 of them, and they're at 4 bases.
You have written a very critical book, critical both of the B-1 bomber and of what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial establishment and the whole defense procurement process. How much cooperation did you get from the Defense Department in writing this book?
I got a lot of cooperation from people from really all walks of life. Generals from the Air Force, so-called captains of industry. Rockwell International was the principal manufacturer. Labor unions that were involved in it, members of Congress. One of the great things about, I think, about our democracy and about our free press is that it is relatively easy to get information from people.
We will be going to the telephones in just a few minutes. Please call us if you have a question or comment. The telephone numbers, if I can find them, in Eastern and Central time zones, area 202-628-2525. In the Mountain and Pacific time zones, 202-783-2727. Let me quote a sentence from your book and get your reaction to it, or get you to tell us what you meant. The nation has built dozens of expensive weapons systems in a disorderly and wasteful process, buffeted by erratic political and economic currents. What does that mean?
What that means is every time we make a decision, whether it's to build a new bomber or an aircraft carrier or a helicopter, that all the pressures of politics in American society come to bear on that decision. And the effect of many special interests competing in the marketplace in terms of defense, I think has not produced ideal results. It's resulted in weapons we don't need. It's resulted in delays. It's resulted in spending too much money on systems and not getting the best systems. The problem is, I think all of us, Bob, start out from believing that we want what's best for the country. We want to defend the country. But all of us also have special interests. I come from San Antonio, Texas. We have many Air Force bases in San Antonio, Texas. Those bases are our special interest. Nobody wants to close their base. People who live in Palmdale, California, and have plants that employ 20 or 30,000 people building a certain airplane have a special interest in the building of that airplane. What I'm talking about is when all of our special interests come to play on making a military decision, the decisions don't necessarily turn out to be the ones that will best serve military need and national interest. Each of the services, they want to do what's best for the country, but each of the services have their own special needs, and they pursue those needs vigorously. In the case of the Air Force, the bomber stands at the heart of the Air Force's very reason for independence and being.
You make a reference or two in your book to SDI, Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative. That may stand as the biggest decision in defense or counter-defense weaponry made by the Reagan administration with the approval of Congress. Do you have the same concerns about SDI that are reflected in your book?
I think that from what I have seen so far, what I've learned so far about SDI as I was working on Wild Blue Yonder, is that there are more political, self-interested politics and economic need driving that program. And there will be even more in the future than any other defense program we've had. My point of view would be that if SDI makes sense to make our country safer at a cost that we can afford, that is a military decision, a national defense decision. It should be made on those grounds. It shouldn't be made on the grounds that there are 200,000 jobs involved in it and various areas of the American economy need it. We can do different and better things with our economic resources.
Our guest tonight is Nick Kotz, author of the new book, Wild Blue Yonder, Money, Politics, and the B-1 Bomber. He's a freelance writer, also a distinguished adjunct professor at American University, a professor of journalism, I believe. Is that true?
That's correct.
And you worked for the Washington Post for 3 years in the 1970s. Before that, worked in Washington for the Des Moines Register, where you won a Pulitzer Prize. You also won the 1985 National Magazine Award for a story on American military leadership. I think that's an unusual coupling. Very few writers, if any others, have won both the Pulitzer and the National Magazine Award. Tell us, if you will, what did you win your Pulitzer for?
My Pulitzer Prize was for an investigation of unsanitary conditions in federally inspected meat packing plants and some attempted cover-up of those conditions by the federal government.
And how did you move from that specialty to your current expertise on military spending?
Well, I got interested in learning about defense issues in a specialized way about 4 or 5 years ago, Bob, by doing a study on military leadership. And I started it at American University with a group of graduate students. And the military leadership piece led to this book in a very specific way.
We'll take our first telephone call from Ulysses, Kansas. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Mr. Kotz. I haven't had a chance to read your book, but I understand from a report on the radio that you single out the McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita. And I was wondering if you could put into some kind of numbers how militarily effective or ineffective the placement of the B-1 bomber in Wichita is or isn't.
Well, I'll come to Wichita, but I contend in the book that 2 of the 4 bases at which the B-1 is located were picked for political reasons rather than pure military strategic reasons. McConnell in Wichita, because Senator Dole of Kansas insisted upon it, and the citizens of Wichita were worried McConnell was going to close down. They put pressure on their senator. Dias in Abilene, Texas, because the Air Force wanted to please then Senator Tower, chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Military officers, Air Force officers, have told me that neither McConnell nor Dias were ideal sites from a military standpoint to base these bombers. In the case of McConnell, if you want the details, McConnell is located in the midst of a crowded urban area. It shares runways with a Boeing Aircraft Company plant. The Air Force has very specific criteria for the basing of the ideal basing of strategic weapons with nuclear warheads, and McConnell doesn't meet them. It was also economically less effective than other places because they did not have storage facilities for nuclear weapons.
I found your discussion of how the B-1 base happened to be located at McConnell especially interesting because it involved 3 different rather prominent figures in Congress. You mentioned that Bob Dole was for the B-1. You had the other Kansas Senator, Nancy Kassebaum, who I believe is against the B-1 bomber, and Dan Glickman, the Wichita area congressman, opposed to it. Can you sort of relate them to the whole story?
Well, as I get the story, I think reliably from Air Force officers who participated in the decision. First of all, Wichita was not being considered. More ideal sites would have been fairly isolated areas in the Dakotas, in Montana, or elsewhere. When Senator Dole started putting the heat on the Pentagon, saying we want this base at McConnell, there was resistance in the Air Force, both because some people didn't like the site and also because Air Force officers did not want to reward Senator Kassebaum. Senator Kassebaum had not only been an outspoken opponent of the B-1, she was the chair of the Senate Military Reform Caucus, which was giving the Pentagon a hard time about a lot of different things.
Hortel, California. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Hi.
I guess I'll turn this television down. Wait a minute. I'm in Quartz Hill, California. That's about 3 or 4 miles from Palmdale, where they build the B-1 bomber. And what I see is for the last 15 or 20 years, all they have up here is glorified welfare. I call the B-1 bomber because all they do is wait from one contract to the other to keep up the employment up here in this Antelope Valley. And this here B-1 bomber really put a boom on around here. Boy, it really made things, but they're indiscriminately building and building everything, and instead of trying to get some permanent industry, instead of that pseudo B-1 bomber, and I was scared to death of that thing while they were testing it. They were testing it over my house in this residential section, and we know that 2 of them have already crashed. Do you believe that a Pelican brought that last B-1 bomber down?
I accept the Air Force's official explanation, which was that a Pelican, which probably weighs somewhere between 25 and 40 pounds, hit the bomber at a particularly sensitive place on the skin of the bomber, and it punctured some very vital electronic control gear. It's not heartening to know that a $280 million plane can be brought down by a Pelican, particularly when that plane has to fly at low altitude where many birds are. But I hope that that was a freak accident and that kind of thing will not happen again.
How about the boom in employment that the caller mentioned? I think you have some figures in your book as to just how many jobs were created by the B-1.
Indeed. In the Palmdale area with Rockwell, there were probably 25 or 30,000 jobs involved at the peak of the program. Nationally, 50 or 60,000 jobs. But the story of Southern California and this bomber is a story that repeats itself endlessly. In the 1960 presidential election, that's 7 presidential elections ago, President Eisenhower, who did not like the predecessor of this plane, which was called the B-70, did not want to build it. At the last moment in the 1960 campaign, he turned that program back on to try to help Nixon win the 1960 election. We see this, and we're in another presidential election. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. In 1971, there were a lot of doubts about the B-1 as it was in its research and development stage. There was a lot of pressure on President Nixon to stop it, restudy it. And all of a sudden, President Nixon had another agenda, getting reelected. And one of the president's reelection programs, a secret one, was called Keep California Green. Keep California Green, according to the memoranda which the archives has, was a program to create 100,000 new aerospace jobs in California between March of 1971 and the election in '72. And they did it. The fact of the matter is, every presidential election year, we have the man who sits in the White House trying to use defense toward political ends. It may be a very natural phenomenon, but I don't think it's a good one.
Burbank, Illinois, please join us.
Good evening. Great that you're on there with the B-1 bomber, one of my favorites, with the Bradley and the MX missile and all that other trash stuff that the Pentagon buys. I was wondering if the B-1 carries nuclear devices, or is supposed to. I know it's supposed to go in under enemy radar. That was, it was originally sold as an airplane that could fly under the Soviet radar and not be detectable, and it could fly farther and faster and carry more, throw weight, nuclear weapons than any other airplane in history and all that trash. How much of that can it actually do, or is it just like the Bradley and like the DVAD and like the other garbage, the M1 tank and all the other garbage that we've been sold? Carter cut the B-1 bomber from the military budget, and Reagan reinstated it. So, how effective is this?
Okay, I think we have your question there. As you answer that question, Mr. Kotz, would you relate the B-1 bomber to the stealth bombers?
Yes, I will. First of all, I'm not as harsh as your caller is. We need weapons to defend ourselves, and I don't think that they're garbage and they're trash. And I don't say in this book that the B-1 bomber will not contribute to national defense. I say it's not as good as it should be. Now, your caller asked what kind of weapons does this bomber carry? What can it do? The bomber is equipped to carry 60 tons of either nuclear bombs or nuclear missiles. One B-1 bomber is equipped with the weaponry to cause 200 times the damage of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. So it is a very, very awesome, powerful weapon.
Huntington Beach, California. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Hi.
I want to talk about Star Wars because I believe it's the most blatant example of wasteful defense spending. Now, I live in Southern California, and which tends to benefit most from these vast military expenditures. However, the Star Wars scenario is not accepted by the vast majority of the scientific community. Hans Bader just spoke at a local college saying that it's a pipe dream, it can't work, it's a huge waste of money. Now, even though I live in this area that would benefit from it, I can see the long term that the nation would suffer by this movement of as much as possibly $1 trillion to a weapon system that can't work. We could employ many, many teachers, health workers, so on and so forth with this same amount of money. Now, on the positive side, what I propose is that every weapon system that we come up with be preceded by a proposal to the Soviet Union to either stop production or eliminate something that's already in production of one of their weapon systems rather than going ahead with these unrealistic dreams.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Let's give Mr. Kotz a chance to respond to that.
Well, I think that the biggest sort of generality about defensive weapons against nuclear attack, such as Star Wars. We went through a very similar debate 20 years ago with the ABM, the anti-ballistic missile system. Eventually, we came to a treaty in 1972 with the Soviets in which both sides said that they would not deploy these systems. Aside from the enormous costs, many scientists say that we will never be able to develop a system that would be effective enough to protect even our military installations, much less our cities and our populations.
Could I ask you at that point, have you been surprised, despite the points you were making, by the amount of support for Star Wars in Congress in these times where budget money is rather tight and Congress is not giving the President everything he asked for Star Wars, and yet they continue to give him very substantial support for Star Wars?
Well, Bob, I think there's a mixture of motives, and we get confused with the mixture of motives is this. Number one, the American people and the members of Congress who represent them do believe in a strong national defense. The vast majority of people in this country want us to have a strong defense. So if there is a possibility of developing a weapon that would defend us against nuclear attack, people want to explore it. But why is there all that support to push ahead at the rate of $3, $4, $5 billion a year or more? Part of it is because of political economic interest. The contracts for Star Wars development are spread over the entire United States, not only to different manufacturers, but to major research universities. And there are a lot of people who are interested in pushing that program, both because they believe in a strong national defense and because they have something at stake in it. And it may be human nature, but we tend to identify our own interests with the common good.
Pinehurst, North Carolina. Go ahead, please.
Well, given what the speaker just said, I have to identify my own interest in this. I have a brother that is a retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force and spent all of that time flying B-52, so I've heard ad infinitum about the deficiencies and obsolescence of that aircraft. And I have another brother who spent close to 20 years with Rockwell International, which builds a B-1, and have heard the same sort of stories about the difficulties of building a state-of-the-art aircraft. So after stating my prejudices or preconceived notions, I'd like to ask two questions. One, is there another aircraft in the history of aviation that can even be compared with the B-1? And if in fact there is not, and I suspect there is not, isn't it very difficult, or isn't it intellectual sophistry to second guess what is the best technology and the best management in the country, or in the world for that matter, giving it their best shot to build something that's never been built before. That is to say, are we letting the best be the enemy of the good?
Are those your two questions?
Yes.
I think you're making some good points. Number one, the B-52s are old. The youngest of the B-52s were built in 1962. They're 25 years old. If you believe in strategic bombers, we do need a new strategic bomber, and we've got one, the B-1. I do not argue in Wild Blue Yonder that we should not have a new strategic bomber. Ever since ICBMs came on the scene, intercontinental ballistic missiles, there has been an argument about just how important it is to have a bomber that will get to a target 8 hours after a war starts. I come down on the side of people that say that there still is a need for a bomber, both as part of the strategic deterrent and for use in a possible conventional war. So on that point, I agree there should be a new bomber. What I argue in the book is that the political process that we went through to come up with a new bomber was horribly wasteful, was erratic, that the B-1 was pushed, pulled, and tugged in different directions. It was stopped and started and stopped and started again, depending upon the prevailing political winds. And that is not an effective way to do national defense. Your second question is, and your comments are also pertinent, and there's a lot to them. In the 1980s, in the aerospace age, in the nuclear age, we are building very, very sophisticated, technologically difficult systems. And the best can be the enemy of the good. In the case of the B-1, I'm afraid that was the case. When we started out in the late 60s and early 70s, the Air Force, the people who wanted to push the state-of-the-art of technology to its limits, were trying to do too much with a very, very difficult assignment. They were trying to have a plane that flew 2.5 times the speed of sound high, 1.5 times the speed of sound on the ground. They had a very complex escape capsule in the plane that they couldn't make work. So the ideal was getting in the way of achieving a practical plane. But if you do believe in bombers, and I think we needed a new bomber, we should have gone about it more effectively. We now have one, the B-1, and we are 8 years, and it's top secret, so we don't know, but we are 8 years and something like $8 to $14 billion into developing another bomber called the B-2 or the Stealth, and it is still not had its first experimental flight.
I'll just add the question that most critics of the manned bomber would throw in at this point. I think you can give me a quick answer to it. Why do we need a strategic bomber when we have such a large force of ICBMs and submarine-launched nuclear missiles, which make up the third leg of the triad?
Bob, there are a number of arguments for the strategic bomber. The triad supposedly builds in elements of safety to the deterrent. The enemy, our adversary, the Soviet Union, might be able to knock out our ICBMs in their silos on the land before we made a decision to fire them. But if they do that, the idea of the other two parts of the deterrent, the submarines and the bombers, is they will be deterred from doing that because they will know that we have other weapons we can use. Some people say submarines are enough. Right now, the submarine is a quite invulnerable weapon. It may not always be. Another reason for the people who argue for bombers is that the bomber is a weapon that provides flexibility, that you don't have to push a button. You don't have to make a decision and push a button that has an irrevocable commitment to a nuclear holocaust. With bombers, the argument has been back 30 years when it started, bombers versus ICBMs. General LeMay, who was a great warrior leader of World War II, he said with bombers, you can get them in the air, you can maneuver them, you can threaten with them, you can project force, but you don't have to make the decision that they're on their way. They provide flexibility to you. Those are a couple of the arguments why strategic bombers are still valid.
Palm Desert, California, you are on C-SPAN.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to make a statement about the Star Wars program. I guess the question I have in mind is why is it that the Russians have approximately 10,000 scientists, great scientists, including laser technology, working on Star Wars themselves and have been for some time? I suggest that they would like to have us back off over a period of time with this new treaty so that they can upgrade theirs to the point where it'll be too late for us to upgrade and implement our system. Thank you.
Well, you're talking about an area of knowledge in which I am not an expert. I read information that argues the point that you do. I also constantly hear testimony from, read articles from scientists who say that neither side is going to be able to perfect a defensive so-called Star Wars system that will be effective. And at this point, I think that what's needed is healthy skepticism. I'm certainly not against research into laser weapons, research into defensive weapons. The question is, how fast and how far do we go?
Canton, Ohio. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I just wanted to ask why the government doesn't give our scientists and our researchers enough time to finish a project once they start it. I don't think you can put a time limit on technology. It seems like we go to start something, we work on it for a short period of time, and all of a sudden they pull the rug out from under everybody and they stop the funds, and we have potentially good projects, and they're just cut in half. They're demolished before they have a chance to even work.
Well, you're pointing to one of the difficulties in the process. As an earlier caller suggested, it takes a long period of time to develop a complex new weapon in the space age. Congress makes annual appropriations in which they determine how much money we're going to spend on various projects. Congress tends to change its mind. Presidents tend to change their minds, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not so good reasons. And one of the suggestions for reform of the process is that we make longer-term commitments to develop weapons so we don't have this stop-go process which is inefficient.
Vancouver, Washington, please join us.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Kotz. B-52 was, of course, quite useful in the Vietnam War. What kind of conventional capability does the B-1 have? Would that be useful in that sort of war?
The B-1 originally, the Air Force was not thinking about using the B-1 conventionally. In fact, the B-1 was not originally conceived of carrying bomb racks for conventional weapons. Under the pressure from some members of Congress led by Senator Glenn, and really under the political pressure of being able to justify this weapon, the B-1 now is being equipped so that it can play a role in conventional war as well as part of the nuclear deterrent. I think that the justification for a strategic bomber should include the ability to project force in a conventional war. The most common way that it would be used, that you hear spoken about, is that in a large-scale conventional war in Europe, that the use of a bomber that could quickly get to the battlefield to attack a large advancing force would serve a useful purpose. So the short answer is yes, the B-1 is able to perform a conventional role.
We went through a period beginning in the late Eisenhower years where a force of B-52 bombers was kept in the air continuously, so they would be able to respond even faster than if they had to take off from an airfield somewhere to a nuclear threat from the Soviet Union. Can you conceive of the B-1 ever being used in that way?
Exactly what way, Bob?
Where Eisenhower kept a force of B-52s flying continuously 24 hours a day.
Eisenhower did, and then Kennedy did, I think, in the early 60s. Well, that is one of the advantages of having that weapon. We have tankers, and you put the bombers in the air, and you put the tankers in the air, and you can keep the bombers in a highly ready state without committing them. Bomber advocates would say that that shows the flexibility and usefulness of bombers.
Grafton, Virginia, go ahead, please.
Sir, I have several comments. Number one...
Try to hold it to two, if you will. We've got a lot of calls waiting.
Okay, quick. If BBs can bring down ballistic missiles, most certainly Pelicans at 600 miles an hour can. If you care about pilots, you replace the B-52. If you watched the papers several years ago, they were refueling one in California and the wing buckled. Tail came off when I was in SAC in New Hampshire in 1958 because of turbulence from low level. If you care about ground troops, General Palmer, who wrote a book about the war, said that the B-52 was the most feared weapon according to intelligence reports that supported, as far as the enemy was concerned. So if you care about pilots, you get a new plane. If you care about the ground guy, you give him a bomber. And then my question is, sir, I just flipped open your book, Wild Blue Yonder, and I haven't read it all, but I noticed you said gold-plated bomber. Now, if you think this is gold-plated at $280 million, you ought to write a book, and do you agree or not, on the C-17, which is probably at pushing $200 million, a far worse decision as opposed to other alternatives.
Tell us about the C-17, if you will.
Well, the C-17 we haven't built yet, but your caller is very knowledgeable, maybe more knowledgeable than I am, about weapons. The C-17 is a new transport plane. McDonnell Douglas is just starting to build it. It has been in research and development for many years, going at least 7 or 8 years. And I'm not quite sure of the point your caller is trying to make, but all weapons are vulnerable. That's what, it's horrible, but that's what war is all about. Offense versus defense. And both sides are trying to develop an offense that can overcome the other side's defense and vice versa. Yes, the B-1 is vulnerable, not only to birds. The B-1 is vulnerable to missiles. We've just seen in Afghanistan very untrained people, the guerrillas in Afghanistan, with Stinger missiles, handheld Stinger missiles, bringing down very sophisticated Soviet planes. So airplanes are vulnerable to attack. The idea of the B-1 was through technology, by flying low, hugging the ground, going under radar, was to try to overcome the advantages of the defense.
You mentioned earlier that the total cost of the 100 B-1s will be $28 billion. That's $280 million per plane, averages out to that. Can you tell us in a few words how the Pentagon arrives at a price of that magnitude?
Well, it starts out by sheer guesswork, because actually it's more than $28 billion. If you add in all the research dollars on the B-1, it's probably $40 billion. And the failed plane before that, it's $50 billion. But it starts out, Bob, with a guesstimate, because when you enter the research and development stage, no one really knows what it's going to cost, because you're trying to produce new technology. When it finally got down to it with the B-1, how many planes we built and what we were going to spend for them was a combination of politics, economics, and military need all mixed together. Secretary Weinberger decided that Congress's choke point on the B-1 bomber was $20 billion in 1981 dollars. And he said, how many bombers can you give us for $20 billion? The Air Force in Rockwell said 100 B-1s. And when you add in the inflation factor, we got up to $28 billion.
San Diego, California. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I have 26 years experience in the aerospace industry with General Dynamics Corporation. My career with them started very early on in the 50s, and I was involved in the development of the Atlas intercontinental ballistic missile and other weapon systems. I'm making this statement because I'm addressing myself to the statements previously made by others with regard to Star Wars, or SDI. At the time of the early development of ICBMs, the scientific community in this country said that hitting targets as small as 100 yards to a quarter of a mile in size at distances of 5,000 nautical miles was impossible. Today, we can hit targets as small as 36 inches at those distances. What I'm trying to say to you is that to say that the SDI system will not work because the present state-of-the-art dictates that it won't work is tomfoolery.
Okay, thank you very much for your comment. We're going to try to squeeze in a couple more calls, or at least one. And we may be too late already, so I'll ask you to respond to that call.
Well, I think we've talked about that. There's a lot of argument about what you can do with strategic defense initiatives, with lasers and other new technology, and I don't think we know the answers to it. I'd make the point I made before. If we do it, if we spend a lot of money on it, it should be for military need, not because it's going to support our political economy.
Riverside, California. We will make this the last call. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, C-SPAN. Thank you. This is a really complex issue, I understand, and I missed the front end of the discussion. Is there some kind of proposal that Mr. Kotz has?
He has written a book called Wild Blue Yonder with the subtitle Money, Politics, and the B-1 Bomber, whether we can see that title one last time before we go off the air. And it is a book in which he both relates the full story of the B-1 bomber, but also relates that to the whole defense procurement process. Is that a synopsis?
Yes. What would I recommend? I would recommend that we have a lot more, that everyone from the president on down to us as citizens need to be more knowledgeable. The president needs independent advice to make sure that when we make military decisions about building weapons, that we make those decisions based on national defense interests, not on self-serving parochial interests. And how do we do that? It isn't some abstract military-industrial complex. It is all of us who are involved. And what is required of our society? What is required is more discipline in our society and a willingness to sacrifice our own interest at times for a broader national interest. The issue in defense really isn't much different than the interest in the deficit. Are we willing to raise taxes if that's what's called for at some point? Are we willing to consume less and save more? The same issues apply to defense. Are we willing to sacrifice a base in our hometown if it's not needed? And there are dozens of bases around this country that aren't needed, and spend that money more effectively.
Thank you very much for being with us. Our guest tonight has been Nick Kotz, the author of the newly published book, Wild Blue Yonder, subtitled Money, Politics, and the B-1 Bomber. We appreciate very much your being with us tonight. Thanks to our C-SPAN viewers for your questions and comments, and have a pleasant evening.
If you have further questions or comments for our guest, Nick Kotz, You can write him in care of Pantheon Books. The address is 201 East 50th Street, New York, New York, 10022.
You're watching C-SPAN, America's network. C-SPAN is a non-profit cooperative created and supported by the cable television industry.